I'm chairing this session, and we have four distinguished presenters. But first, what we're going to do is that we're going to sum up the three workshops this afternoon by rapporteurs. And I would like them to come up one after another. It's always nice to know what's been happening around when you're not able to be many places at one time. I would also like to draw your attention to the books that we have outside of this facility. They are very fairly priced. The printing cost almost only, and they are on various very interesting and intriguing issues of the Arctic. So please, guests, take a look, at least. And now I'm going to introduce the first rapporteur from the workshop, the West Nordic region. Please step up.
Hi, my name is Kristín. I'm from the University of Tromsø, and I was assigned the task to summarize one of the workshops today. First, I would just like to say thank you for the opportunity to come here. It's been very interesting, and I've learned a lot.
Maybe if you
it's not on.
Oh, it's not on. Okay. It should be on. No, it's not on.
It's on, isn't it? No?
And now it's
Yeah.
okay.
So the first workshop was about the West Nordic region, which consists of Iceland, Greenland, and the Faroe Islands. There were three lectures. The first was about local government institutions in the region under pressure, by Dr. Beinta Jakobsdóttir from Molde University College in Norway. The other was about cooperation in a Nordic and West Nordic context, the case of Greenland, by Dr. Maria Akren from the University of Greenland. And the third was a report on economic West Nordic and Arctic cooperation by Egil Nilsson from the Polar Research Institute of China. So I have sort of, for me there was three main questions that these three lectures asked. The first, I think, was who is competent to set the agenda, and the other, how to accommodate autonomous regions, what kind of status should they have, and the last, what are common economic interests in this region. So the first about Beinta, she talked about the West Nordic region, these three states in international fora. I have to excuse, I only had half an hour to prepare this, so and she talked about how these three actors are not regarded as natural participants in all decision-making processes because of their status, or maybe rather the lack of status. She talked about how participation in international forums on these kind of issues, like the Arctic, the participation is more about appropriateness than competence and relevance. And the future of this West Nordic region is of global interest due to, for example, climate change. So she said that there is a need for a new institutional change to coordinate these interests. Then we had from the University of Greenland, she talked about the status of these autonomous regions, that this has been on the agenda for discussion, especially in the 60s, in the 80s, and now in the 2000s. So she talked about how in a Nordic and Arctic context, what kind of membership should these states have? Well, in the Nordic Council, the Faroe Islands were a member in '71 and Greenland in 1983. And their main membership status, they have 2 seats each. In 1985, the West Nordic Parliamentary Council was established, which from 1997 is known as the West Nordic Council. They focus on culture, political, economical, and social issues, and they also have a task of dealing with other actors. So the last lecture about West Nordic, he talked about the West Nordic Council in an economic perspective, how this region is, they are sort of the winners of the future regarding change in the Arctic, that due to the fact that investments will increase due to the new transportation routes, not only from Asia to Europe, but also from the US or Americas to Europe. He also pointed out that this West Nordic region is actually 10% of the Arctic population. And then he talked about this idea of a West Nordic free trade zone, which consists of making regional economics stronger and increase global exports and find new markets. So that was it. I know this was probably the worst presentation these 2 days, but yeah, I hope you got the big picture. So thank you.
Thank you. This was excellent. So the next rapporteur is going to tell us about the Polar Code and the Law of the Sea workshop. Go ahead.
Hello everyone. My name is Kjersti Irina Rosen of Aronsen. I'm from the University of Tromsø, and I am going to tell you about a short summary of the Polar Code and the Law of the Sea. The first focus was on the Polar Code and the Law of the Sea of Dr. Erik Røsæg, professor of the University of Oslo. He pointed out a maritime law with focus on ship safety, security, and pollution preventions that will secure safe operations in the Arctic area in the future. He based it on the code mandatory, which all the flag states have to follow or act by it. But the coast states' perspective is on the internal waters and ports, and where UNCLOS does not have a lot to say about it. And the Northern Sea route, Russia is controlling the port and has the mandate to, I don't know how to say it, but act by it. Outside the exclusive economic zone on 200 nautical miles, the high seas is a very important area of the Polar Code. where there is no security, liability, or insurance, and no institutional security around it, where the professor concludes with that the flag states has to take responsibility of what's going on outside the exclusive economic zone, beyond the 200 nautical miles. The second focus was pointed out by Dr. Golter G. Latrup, lecture fellow from Duke University, on Arctic maritime boundary delimitations. The limitations follow the UNCLOS decisions of territorial water and economic exclusive zones, where some of them has expanded the continental shelf. Russia in 2001, Norway in 2006 and 2009, and Canada in 2013. I don't know if I got it all right, but I guess so. I'm not the expert here, I'm just reporting what I've heard. Denmark, outside the Arctic area, has expanded, and USA wants to apply for expanded extensions in the Arctic zone of the continental shelf. The boundaries that has been drawn is USA-Russia boundary in 1990s. In 2006, Greenland and Norway draw the boundaries, and in 2010, Russia and Norway draw the boundaries. The boundaries that hasn't been drawn is between Greenland and Canada, USA and Canada, USA and Russia, where the continental shelf is still being produced or processed. But the law of the sea will be the roadmap in the Arctic, where the solutions in the future will show this. Yeah. And the last focus was put by the Dr. Bjarni Mar Magnusson, assistant professor of University of Reykjavík. He pointed at the pathway for the United States to establish the continental shelf beyond 200 nautical miles in the Arctic Ocean without becoming a party of UNCLOS. I'm even more unsure of this one, but I will try my very best. USA want to extend the continental shelf beyond 200 nautical miles until 600 nautical miles. From the president of UNCLOS, this is not accepted, if I can put it that way. USA are outside the UNCLOS and cannot put the standard that they are not a part of, as they are seen in the UNCLOS. But if the other parts accept the extensions of the continental shelf of USA, there is a pathway. I have a picture of it on my phone. So
Young generation.
Number one of the possible pathway: make a public declaration about U.S. entitlement. Number two, domestic legislation. Number three, deposit charge on other relevant information to the Secretary General of the UN. Number four, make the scientific evidence for U.S. entitlement accessible. Number five, wait for possible challenges from other states. And another important aspect is to create the continental shelf boundary with Canada. I hope I got it all, but yes, this is it. Thank you. But can I ask you something? I learned from Barack Obama. Can you be with me on a selfie? Okay. I will smile. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this refreshing moment. And the third rapporteur is going to tell you about what happened in the balance between business developments and environmental protection in the Arctic. Ooh.
Hi, my name is Jonas Zodu. I'm a PhD student at University of Tromsø. Actually, University of Tromsø is now has a new name, the Arctic University of Norway. So I'm not a political science or something. I'm an engineer. I'm dealing with oil and gas extraction in Arctic. So I know some sort of environmental aspect and risk assessment. So now I'm going to summarize the balance between business development and environmental protection in the Arctic. Okay. The first speaker was Dr. Ami from University of Alaska, and her topic was the value of scenarios for Arctic futures, facilitating expert dialogue across scales and interest. And she also had another topic: how do you plan effectively when the future of what matters to you is uncertain? Actually, she started by explaining what uncertainty has, and she started by describing different millennium ecosystem and human well-beings and some sort of freedom and choice balance. And she also tries to explain what principles are based in the Arctic region. For example, she mentioned two principles: principles of resilience in ecological perspective, and also principle of deliberative democracy. This is a kind of social science perspective. And also there is a good way of, she described it in a good way. She called it black swans or something. Black swans is kind of the facts that we don't know, It's kind of uncertain for another uncertainty. So also she tries to explain different kind of scenarios, and she defined a scenario as a process of asking what if, what will happen, or what if something goes wrong or something. And she also tries to differentiate different type of scenarios, such as external export model, and the second one was participation model, and the third one is organization model. And she also tried to define some sort of how to assess different interviews from different local organizations and how to handle that. And also she tries to explain a quality scenario, and this quality scenario has three things: consistent, and the second one is it must be plausible, and the third one is it needs to be robust. So also she tries to come up with a focal question, and or the focal question in Arctic could be like a future energy development, and she summarized by discussing different aspects. And I will go to the second speaker. The second speaker was Dr. Stefan Mako from Department of Environmental Science, University of Virginia. And the topic was environmental aspect of hydrocarbon exploration in the Arctic. And the first, when Dr. Stefan started by explaining why Arctic, why do we need to go and drill in the Arctic region? Because we have around, let's say 40%, not 40%, 13% of resource, oil and gas resource are located in the Arctic region. And 80% of those are in offshore, and we also have some sort of, if there is kind of oil impact or if there is some sort of oil spill in the Arctic, we are not ready for some sort of preparedness. So oil spill cleanup technologies are not well developed yet to deal with Arctic regions, and environmental concerns are very high in the Arctic region because we have sensitive marine ecology. So, and also there is a demand growth because in 2050 we will be like 10 billion population. So in order to have energy, we need to have a lot of demand. And so that's why we need to go to Arctic and drill. And based on different estimation from Geological Survey of United States, we have some sort of reserve in the Arctic region, and that's why we need to drill. And the discussion goes on. Also, there are some sort of gas hydrates in the seabed. We have around 400 gigatrillion or something. If I'm mistaken, they will correct me. 400 gigatrillion barrel of oil are located in the Arctic region, and oh yeah, okay. Finally, to conclude, Dr. Stefan says that we are not ready technologically to deal with oil spill in the Arctic region. So I will try to summarize the third speaker. Okay. The third topic was safety and security in the high north, responsibility and opportunity, by Snorre Gerel, Iceland Coast Guard, and he tries to explain different challenges in the Arctic region. The main challenge was communication, and the other challenge was we have increased activity. It could be like air or sea or land activities. It could be tourist, cargo, and gas, oil and gas, mining, and there are different activities, and there are different population coming to Arctic, and there is a lot of different challenge. So response time will be much higher in the Arctic region, and due to remoteness and due to lack of poor infrastructure or lack of infrastructures. And also he showed us some sort of scenarios in Greenland and how to have some sort of response from Iceland to Greenland, and he tried to show different response from Norway, Iceland, and also Greenland, how to deal. And that was it. Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you very much. And now we move on to Dr. Michael Byers. We start here by the third plenary on North American leadership in the Arctic Council. Michael, the floor is yours.
I have one. I have just one slide. You all recognize the fellow who's standing in front of Hillary Clinton. He is, of course, the Prime Minister of Canada, Stephen Harper. This picture was taken in March 2010 in Chelsea, Quebec. Canada hosted a meeting of the Arctic Five, the 5 Arctic Ocean coastal states, and did not invite Iceland, Sweden, Finland, or any of the Arctic indigenous peoples. And that's one of the reasons why the then Secretary of State was unhappy. In fact, she said, and I quote, "We need all hands on deck because there is a huge amount to do and not much time to do it." I started with this quote and this picture for a couple of reasons. One is that there's a reasonably good chance that Hillary Clinton will be the next president of the United States. And she clearly understands the Arctic and the urgency of the issues there. And this obviously provides the possibility of some continuity of U.S. Arctic policy, because the Arctic is becoming more of an interest to the Obama administration as the United States prepares to take the chair of the Arctic Council next April. The other thing, just to say, and it's obvious for this room, is that the Arctic is now at the center of global politics for 2 main reasons. One being climate change, which is more advanced and more visible in the Arctic than just about anywhere else on Earth, and is likely the defining issue of our age. And the only reason we have conferences about the Arctic is because of climate change, right? Which is causing everything else to happen, including the dramatic thinning and receding of the sea ice. The second reason why the Arctic is at the center of global politics today is because of the relationship with Russia. I am one of a number of people in this room who can remember the Cold War, and that the Arctic was a front line in the Cold War. The situation is certainly far from that today. I don't lose sleep over the fear of nuclear holocaust like I lost sleep when I was a child. And it's important to keep this in perspective. But certainly the situation with Russia is not good. And I'll, at the end of my presentation, come back to this, because I think the Arctic is also, in this context, an opportunity. Anyway, the United States is about to take the chair of the Arctic Council in April. Heather and I were at a conference in Washington, D.C. last month, where we were privileged to hear the first official speech of the United States' new special envoy on the Arctic, Admiral Robert Papp, the recently retired commandant of the U.S. Coast Guard, a very senior and therefore significant appointment. And I was certainly amazed by the scope of ambition that was conveyed in that speech. At one point, he said that the United States needs to engage with the Arctic in the same way that it engaged with space after Sputnik was launched by the Soviet Union. That there needed to be that all hands on deck, all of government approach to prioritizing these issues. And as he spoke, he spoke very much about the prioritization as centered on cooperation, on multilateralism, and on the Arctic Council. It was very exciting. for someone who believes in international law and multilateralism, to hear you know, a very senior U.S. diplomat talk about this being a Sputnik moment, grappling with the challenges of the Arctic. We will see. The proof will be in implementation the next 2.5 years. But the ambition is quite clearly there. And so in response to that speech, I gave a small presentation of my own in which I challenged the State Department and Admiral Papp to actually think about what the details of an ambitious agenda would look like for U.S. leadership in the Arctic, both within the Arctic Council and outside the Arctic Council. And I'm going to just walk through that list fairly quickly now, so you get a sense of what might be possible if the United States decided to really lead, to lead boldly on these issues. The first thing to say is that the Arctic Council has initiated the negotiation conclusion of two international treaties for the Arctic, one on oil spill preparedness and response, the other on search and rescue. It's interesting that those treaties contain no new obligations. They simply take existing obligations from other generally applicable treaties and specify them for the Arctic. And I suggested to Admiral Papp and his colleagues that now's the time to get serious about actually putting some content into those areas by way of a couple of protocols to those agreements. So why not a protocol to the oil spill preparedness and response agreement that actually requires and specifies the forward positioning of oil spill equipment and personnel so that you could actually deal with a major spill. It's one thing to say that you've got lines of communication, you have to think about what you would do. No real hard commitments. A similar protocol for the search and rescue agreement, perhaps, for instance, requiring that countries forward position long-range search and rescue helicopters so they can reach the full extent of their search and rescue zones in the Arctic without having to refuel. That would be possible. That would be real implementation. Maybe a protocol that actually set that out. I can see the gentleman from the Icelandic Coast Guard saying, "Oh, that would cost a lot of money," and it's true. It would, but it would make your job easier if all the Arctic countries were ready at that level to implement. A couple other things to mention. There is movement towards an oil spill prevention agreement, thanks in part to U.S. leadership, even while it has not been in the chair. That needs to move forward during the next 2.5 years. And that oil spill prevention agreement needs to be meaningful. It needs to have real details. For instance, it needs to deal seriously with the issue of liability caps. And I would suggest following best practice and actually removing liability caps on Arctic drilling to provide not only the oil companies but the insurance companies to provide the incentive to make sure they take all possible safety measures in Arctic oil exploration and exploitation. I think it should also deal, this new agreement, with the issue of same-season relief wells. In Norway and Greenland, I understand that there is a requirement for same-season relief wells. Both the United States government and the Canadian government are considering removing those requirements in their own jurisdictions under pressure from oil companies, and I think a multilateral agreement could put a stop to that erosion of the standards that exist, because if you don't stop a blowout during that small summer season, that oil is going to be spewing out of the wellhead all through the long Arctic winter and spring. The United States has already shown leadership on black carbon, which is one of the sort of easier elements of climate change to deal with, the climate forcers as they're called. We need an agreement on black carbon that's meaningful, implementing across the Arctic in particular, scrubbing mechanisms and other ways of reducing these pollutants, which of course absorb solar energy and melt snow and ice more quickly than it otherwise would. We need a meaningful agreement on Arctic haze, which changes the reflexivity of clouds and actually therefore acts as a climate forcer. These are things that could be dealt with and should be dealt with under a U.S. chair. And then I added this to my list because of something that Admiral Papp said. I think the United States should proceed with the idea of a regional seas arrangement for the Arctic Ocean, modeled perhaps on the OSPAR convention that actually applies in the waters around Iceland. A regional seas arrangement would be a great way of coordinating measures taken within national jurisdiction around the Arctic, and then building on those coordinated national measures to take measures in international waters, like marine protected areas. And this has been done under OSPAR here in the Northeast Atlantic, and if you were to lean forward and to be bold, this would be the sort of thing you'd try to do in the Arctic. And yes, it would be really difficult to get Russia to agree to this right now. But again, this is a bold agenda. And then outside the Arctic Council, just very quickly, in the breakout section on the Polar Code, we were talking about how Part 1 is moving forward towards being adopted, that Part 1 is on ship safety, that Part 2 of the Polar Code is still being negotiated within the International Maritime Organization. That needs to be meaningful, and it needs to be implemented, and the United States can exercise maximum influence to that effect. The United States has already held a number of discussions with other Arctic countries about the possibility of a regional fisheries management organization for the Central Arctic Ocean, a little bit like the Northeast Atlantic Fisheries Organization or the North Atlantic Fisheries Organization, that applies both on the east and the west of the ocean that we're currently in. This is ambitious, and there is in fact, there is considerable hesitation on the part of some countries, but we need to have these kinds of measures in place involving non-Arctic states, the long-range shipping states, before the first exploratory fishing takes place with trawlers from, for instance, China or South Korea or Spain. In one of the sessions today, we spoke about the Beaufort Sea maritime boundary dispute between Canada and the United States. The United States could very usefully negotiate a resolution to that, providing some certainty for things like search and rescue and regulatory implementation over things like cruise ships and oil drilling in the Beaufort Sea. The United States could encourage that Canada, Denmark, and Russia follow the Article 76 provisions with regards to extended continental shelves in the Central Arctic Ocean. Canada has wobbled a bit on this, needs to be brought back into line, and that would include reminding all three countries that there is a principle of equidistance that applies for international maritime boundary delimitation. And again, Canada is the country that has stepped out of line here, and is, of course, how do I say this, susceptible to U.S. pressure. There's an issue of Arctic straits, the legal status of the Northwest Passage, and the straits that connect the different portions of the Northern Sea Route. Canada and Russia actually have the exact same legal position. The United States is by far the most significant opponent, the only consistent public opponent of Russia and Canada's claims. Look, this needs to be negotiated. You cannot, in a rapidly melting Arctic Ocean, allow those kinds of legal disputes to persist between, on the one hand, two very close allies, and on the other hand, the major NATO country and its Cold War adversary. This needs to be talked about and resolved now. And then being really, really bold, I suggested to Admiral Papp that the United States should consider leading an initiative to demilitarize the surface of the Arctic Ocean, because it's not currently militarized. But it will be soon if we do not do anything, because as the ice melts, surface military ships will move into that area. And as they do, Russia in particular will become very nervous about the possibility of anti-submarine capacity on the surface in the hands of NATO allies, NATO adversaries. And that could be destabilizing, as just about everyone here will know. Nuclear missile submarines have in their own perverse way provided a great deal of stability over the course of the last half century. And adding anti-submarine capabilities on the surface of the Arctic Ocean would actually result in some destabilization. It's always good to demilitarize a zone before it becomes militarized. Look at the Spitsbergen Treaty and Svalbard as an example of that. And I give you this last example because I think the most important thing that the United States could do, and what I think the United States is currently intending to do, is to use the Arctic as a way to stay engaged with Russia during the tense times that exist, especially over Ukraine. Let me just remind you of two things, and then I'll close. WikiLeaks was a treasure trove for political scientists and for people who try to influence policy, because we actually know as a result of WikiLeaks what was going on in many places just 4 or 5 years ago. So for instance, we know that the US Embassy in Moscow sent a cable back to the State Department encouraging full cooperative engagement with Russia in the Arctic as a way to, quote, strengthen the moderates in the Kremlin, end quote. I think that rationale may still apply today. We also know, because of WikiLeaks, that in January 2010, Stephen Harper met with the Secretary General of NATO and told him that there was no role for NATO in the Arctic because, quote, relations with Russia in the Arctic are good, end quote. In public, Stephen Harper was complaining about Russian bombers violating Canadian airspace, which they had not done. In private, he was actually very positive about the state of cooperation. And I say this simply to say that there is, or at least there has been, a recognition that the Arctic is a good place to stay engaged, to jaw instead of to war, as Churchill once said. We've done this for a long time. I mentioned the Cold War and the threat of nuclear holocaust. Right at the peak of the Cold War in 1973, the 5 Arctic Ocean countries came together. Soviet Union, the United States, Canada, Denmark, Norway, to negotiate the Polar Bear Treaty. And they did this because polar bears were suddenly at threat of extinction because big game hunters had started to use helicopters and icebreakers to chase the bears down. And in recognition of their common concern for preserving this iconic species, and the polar bear is an iconic species in all of the Arctic Ocean coastal states, the 5 countries came together at the height of the Cold War and committed to prohibiting the use of icebreakers and helicopters to hunt polar bears. So again, the situation in Ukraine is bad. It's not as bad as the relationship was between the Soviet Union and NATO in 1973. We could still save the polar bear in 1973. So when we think about US leadership in the Arctic Council, it's a challenge. There's a huge amount of work to be done. The United States clearly wants to lead. This woman sees the Arctic as an important place to lead and may well be president before the end of the American term in the chair of the Arctic Council. I think that's pretty exciting. And as a Canadian who has been embarrassed by the lack of ambition the last year and a half, let me just say that I look forward to April. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Michael. This was food for thought. And now we get the American perspective from Dr. Stephen Lamy from University of Southern California. Please, the floor is yours. And I guess that we have to go outside of this, see if next
So while she's
slide
trying
is
to
here.
find that, I want to point something out to Michael. That face that she had. Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama come to Los Angeles all the time to get money. And she turns Los Angeles into a place where you can't get home for 3 hours. So she's probably trying to figure out how she's going to make it in Los Angeles in terms of that. Recently, I was at a conference at the Council of Foreign Relations in New York City. And at that conference, they were talking about drivers of U.S. foreign policy. So I want you to keep this in mind as we talk about this, my presentation. Number 1 was climate change. Number 2 was globalization. Number 3 was demographic change. Number 4 was technological change. Number 5 was domestic politics and electoral calculations. And number 6 was the political culture of the United States. What I'd like to do is go through a series of suggestions about what our grand strategy of the United States is. And this is not seeming to work. There you go. No, this is the wrong one. I can be typical academic and just talk about anything. Yeah, this, okay. So this is a quote from one of my colleagues at USC, Ron Steele, he gave a presentation in 2000. And I think this is where we are in terms of sort of our grand strategy. During the Cold War, we had a vocation, now it's gone. Once we had a powerful enemy, now it's gone. Once we had obedient allies, now we have trade rivals. Once we knew how to define our place in the world and what our interests were, and now we have no idea. Once we fretted about our critics called our arrogance of power, now we wonder whether we are too timid and cautious. Now, some people may have a different viewpoint, but I think that viewpoint sort of sums up where we are in terms of foreign policy and grand strategy. My critical assumption is the U.S. power and influence is not in decline. There's a lot of discussion that the United States is in decline. But the U.S. public is world-weary and war-weary. And leaders have not developed a grand strategy and a foreign policy sextant that essentially the American public embraces. The other point is the Arctic is a peripheral issue in U.S. foreign policy. Some see it as a domestic policy area, but electoral calculations and domestic politics may shape in the future how the Arctic is framed. One of the points is that there's no issue leader and no issue cluster, and this is cause for concern. We have senators from Alaska and Congress, and we have certainly people from Alaska that are important. But as Lassi said in his presentation yesterday, that Finland is landlocked in terms of the Arctic. Well, the United States public is intellectually landlocked when it comes to the Arctic, at least the public in the lower 48 states and Hawaii. Certainly there's a concern in Alaska for these things. So let me first define grand strategy. In this case, we're looking at grand strategy as theory or logic that guides our leaders in seeking security in a very complex and insecure world. This is sort of the intellectual architecture of our policy, and it's what we use in terms of a coherent set of ideas about what a nation should accomplish in the world and how it should go about doing that. How should it achieve the things that it's trying to do in the world? And so I'm going to use this as a starting point for my discussion of grand strategy options. And you didn't know, but there is going to be a little bit of a quiz in this particular one. I'm going to go through some options. Then I want you to think about what Michael said about American priorities and what I'll talk about American priorities and say which grand strategy you think is best for us to realize those particular goals. Let me first start off with something a little bit pessimistic for people in the room. And this is one of Mike's colleagues, Andrew Bacevich, who, if you haven't read Bacevich, you should read Bacevich. He's a very interesting gentleman. He talks about in his book, Washington Rules, of a credo that has sort of dictated American foreign policy since Truman. And he claims that the Obama administration basically has embraced this same credo. The four assertions are somewhat scary for some. The world must be organized and shaped. Only the U.S. has the capacity to prescribe and enforce such a global order. American principles have universal validity, and it's our job to articulate those principles, and those should define the international order. And with few exceptions, everyone understands and accepts the reality that the U.S. wants, and they want the U.S. to lead. I knew that would go over well. By the way, I should point out I'm a dual citizen of Canada and the United States, so I have someplace to go. So what are the strategy options? If that's the credo that sort of rules in DC, if Basevich is correct, what are the strategy options? So I'll start with the first, and that is sort of a neo-isolationist policy. And this is the idea that national defense, the protection of U.S. security, liberty, and property is the only vital U.S. interest. Sovereignty is key. Clearly that applies to the Arctic. Minimal intervention abroad, promotion of U.S. values is dangerous. It can cause problems that spill back. No crusades, because those crusades only breed resentment. Now this could mean, from this strategy point, a minimal Arctic agenda with a focus on Alaska and the domestic side of things. And it could also mean very functional or low politics issues with a few long-term, having few long-term entanglements. The focus will be on sovereignty and homeland security. So there's option one. Option two is what a selective engagement strategy, and this says that the U.S. major concerns are Northeast Asia, the Western Hemisphere, Middle East, Southwest Asia, and Europe. And the concern is always for what we consider a great power war. And there are still people around believing that we are potentially close to that. So balance of power with Russia and other great powers is critical in this case. The public is really unwilling to invest in global police duties, any sort of humanitarian intervention, or in U.S. primacy or hegemony. There are narrow interests defined in terms of power, both relative and absolute. And my friend and colleague, John Mearsheimer, loves this particular perspective. Neo-isolation criticism is that form of view that the U.S. must maintain substantial military force. That would be a criticism of this particular perspective, and that is still alive. Remember that the neocons were going to run the Romney foreign policy, and they are still around. And these were the ones that brought us Iraq and Afghanistan and other such activities. This could mean concern about Russian Arctic moves and the potential of the Chinese gaining access to Arctic resources. Key point here is that if you embrace this view, you frame issues. So a Chinese move is framed as a particular threat. And this may mean the permanent securitization of the Arctic. And this can cause some policy problems and problems with our allies in the Arctic Council. The cooperative security arrangement is one, perhaps, and one of our earlier speakers had, I'm still trying to figure out where it fit, but he had Hobbes, Grotius, and Kant up there. So this would be sort of a Grotian perspective, and that is to act collectively through international institutions, democracies working together in cooperative regimes, incentives for the great powers to cooperate. The only problem there, two of the great powers in the world are not democracies, at least from the perspective of the United States. Regime building and policy areas, focus on strategic interdependence, collective security, and collective action. This strategy has probably the best chance to enhance U.S. interests and participation in the Arctic Council and other regional institutions. A lot of people believe that this is the Obama administration. But if you listen and watch television in the United States or read the New York Times, etc., we have heard many, many times, probably hundreds of times, that it is the Obama administration that killed Osama bin Laden. And part of the reason is that he's looking at domestic politics and electoral calculations. And the American public is moving us maybe away from this cooperative security. He also, in my opinion and many others, has a pretty weak foreign policy team that perhaps is not able to articulate this cooperative security and at least implement it, to use the term used earlier. There are many people now thinking about running for U.S. president and those who are organizing around certain candidates for U.S. president that still hold on to this strategy of primacy. And that is the one that was articulated in the words of Andrew Basevich, that we are the only, a preponderance of U.S. power ensures peace. Washington rules in the American century, which they borrowed from Henry Luce in the 1930s. Constrain or contain all potential adversaries and satisfy all coalition partners. This is a lot coming from the Bush defense planning guidance. And if you haven't read that, I strongly recommend you looking at it. It was released surreptitiously in the New York Times. It was basically the policy that would determine whether the United States, how the United States foreign policy would be after the end of the Cold War. It became a very important document later on in the Bush II administration. This could be the foreign policy of a new Republican administration. some of us are not as optimistic about the chances of Hillary Clinton. The Arctic and Jeb Bush is starting to rise in many people's minds as their candidate. So we have, like many European states, we do have royalty. The Arctic region would be framed as a strategic region in this case, and the Arctic Council would be okay as a functional or low politics policy arena, but little investment in the expansion of the institution. There's a new policy, though, that has come up by Barry Posen, which is getting a lot of airplay. And this may be good or bad for the Arctic or for American leadership. Probably bad for American leadership. And this is a policy, he's devoted about 300 pages in a book to this thing called restraint. And he's making the assumption that U.S. citizens are world weary and war weary, and domestic concerns such as health care, housing are on the rise. And his option is this thing called restraint, which basically means rationing the use of U.S. military only to protect vital national interests. The Arctic would probably fall into that. Staying out of other civil wars or humanitarian disasters. Refuse to promote democracy or human rights in areas where they are unlikely to take root. Demand that U.S. allies pay their own way, and give up global activism and the desire to establish hegemony. This actually might be the grand strategy for Arctic cooperation, but because more resources and attention might be put on the Arctic agenda with regard to Alaska in particular. So these are the options that we have in terms of from a security theorist standpoint. So if you look at Obama's national security, so you got those theories in mind, right? Let's look at what Obama's strategy is and where does it fit, at least rhetorically, not necessarily in terms of implementation. The principles that guide U.S. policy here include the following. Safeguards for peace and stability by acting in concert with allies. What does that sound like? Well, it's late afternoon. Class, what does that sound like? Which are the strategies? Probably sounds a little bit like cooperative security, doesn't it? In the cooperative security. Use both scientific and traditional or indigenous information and knowledge to make the best policy decisions. Sounds like a very collective, cooperative way of doing things. Develop partnerships with Alaska, which Mike mentioned earlier. Glad we're finally reaching out to Alaska. Maybe we'll take over your airlines. The Arctic states, other international partners, and key private sector actors to develop critical resources and work with Alaska Native populations, recognizing both their interests and legal partnerships in the region. So if you look at that strategy, it sounds very much like a cooperative security sort of strategy. However, there's where the implementation has not occurred. This is great. These are principles, right? These are principles that guide. If you look at the priorities, which are pretty much the same, advancing U.S. security changes a little bit, isn't it? You know, advancing U.S. security interests that include safe commercial and scientific operations, protecting U.S. territory, protecting the Arctic environment, and working to promote international and regional cooperation with the Arctic Council. So, at least rhetorically, the Obama administration, and I have to say at the end of the second Bush administration, was very much of a cooperative security approach. But it has not, in my opinion, been successfully implemented. And part of that has to do with domestic politics and electoral calculations. When Admiral Papp, before he became the special representative, was when he was in the Coast Guard, he's had 3 strategic objectives, which might give us some, I didn't hear his speech in Washington, but may give us some idea of where he's going. This is more for his agency. Improving awareness, this is a need for surveillance, monitoring, modernizing governance, the Coast Guard will work, and then broadening partnerships. That too, to me, sounds like a cooperative security structure. So, and then in the U.S. State Department in 2013, national strategy says protect U.S. national interests and homeland security, promote responsible stewardship, and foster international cooperation. And here's Kerry speaking in July of 2014. The Arctic region is the last global frontier in a region where enormous growing strategic climate, environment, and national security implications for the U.S. and the world. Again, sounds a lot like the issue of cooperative security. So the Center for American Progress, which would fall into sort of a democratic position, has come out with a plan for Kerry's and American leadership. Climate change should read. the president of Iceland said the other day, he's asked the question, why is China interested in the Arctic? Some of you might be saying, why is California interested in the Arctic? We are going to become an independent state if certain people win the election. No. The puckish response would be that we're concerned about high surf, but the real issue is that I haven't seen rain in Los Angeles since January. We had 3 inches of rain last year. We are in a severe drought with water rationing, etc., and it has to do with something called climate change. It's changing the whole Los Angeles landscape. We're now being paid to take out our lawns and our flowers, etc., by the city. So we are changing what's where. We are a desert, we're going back to that desert, and part of it has to do with severe climate change. So they said other issues are conserve marine and coastal ecosystems, ensure global security by minimizing potential conflicts, and you can read the list that they're saying are very practical issues and things that we can do in terms of a U.S. agenda. But here are some obstacles. One is a lack of political interest and awareness. The Americans simply do not know. We were once described as a society that is deaf, dumb, and blind when it comes to foreign affairs. It is not a priority of the U.S. public in terms of this. An awareness of the Arctic is simply not there. There is no strong issue leader in Congress and no strong issue cluster of members of Congress or the Senate that can push this through, especially with this. It's now projected that the Republicans are going to basically take control of the Senate. And with Republicans taking control of the Senate, the Obama administration basically has 2 years of really nothing they can do in terms of changing policy. So there's a polarization of the policy process in Congress that is just amazing. Going back there just about every month for meetings, et cetera, it's amazing how polarized it is. There's competing interest groups in terms of oil and resource industries versus the environmentalists. And then there's something that's part of our political culture in the United States, is that we are sort of captivated by what we call an issue cycle. Some of you probably, the environmentalists, are aware of the notion of Down's issue cycle. And this is the area that in the United States we take an issue comes and we have this period of alarm discovery. And there's a gradual increase of awareness. And then the third phase is we become aware of the costs in terms of our own individual life. Because we are an I society, not a we society. Many of you come from we societies. The United States is very much an individualist society. And so there's an awareness of the costs. And once there's an awareness of the costs, there's a decline of interest. And this cycle works very fast in the United States in terms of the issue cycle. And when there's a decline of interest, it then goes back to the experts and not part of the public domain. And we're caught up in that issue cycle with regard to the Arctic. And the other is the primacy of grand strategy advocates. The foreign policy elite in the United States tend not to be part of the cooperative security group. The foreign policy elites tend to be part of their grand strategy advocates. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So our next presenter is Dr. Heather Exner-Pirot. She's from the University of Saskatchewan, and maybe she has something on the we perspective. She's going to talk about the schism between Canadian and Nordic perceptions.
Thank you. I'll say it's less about we and more about us and they. I will mostly talk about the Canadian Arctic Council chairmanship, but I guess we're deep into it. We're already giving the post-mortem of the Canadian chairmanship, even though it's only about 70% of the way through. But I've been brooding on this for a long time, and I think what it's demonstrated really is some differences, real differences in perspectives between Nordic and Europe perspectives and Canadian, maybe North American perspectives more broadly. So tension, what tension? And it's easy for our outsiders to say, oh, the Arctic Council, it's cooperative and happy, and it has that good reputation, and it's certainly deserved. But for those of you who, don't read, Arctic, hashtag Arctic on Twitter all the time, it has been a difficult chairmanship. It has not been very popular. Internally, it's been difficult. Administratively, it's been difficult. And a lot of people are very dissatisfied with it from inside and outside and from Canada and external to Canada. So what were the problems? The Canadian agenda was a big problem for a lot of people. And the agenda was development for peoples of the North. And if you're from Canada, you were very surprised that this was controversial at all. Development for the peoples of the North. But yet it was. And it was I think the integrity of the purpose was questioned. I think having Prime Minister Harper did not help the perception that this would be a positive development or a sustainable development at all. So, and then the Canadians saying, what, you know, you don't want us to do development? What other continent or region could you go to and say, no, you know, development isn't a good idea. We should focus on something else. So that was kind of the philosophical discussion. But as I say, also administratively, organizationally, the Canadian chairmanship has not been well taken, I'll say. Some people think it's quite dictatorial, actually. And in Canada, we're used to the PMO being very controlling. But here it's spilled over into the Arctic Council. So even on the behalf of Department of Foreign Affairs, who I personally think are very competent, they're getting a lot of their messaging and a lot of their control from the Prime Minister's office. Leona Glucock came onto the scene, is not familiar, is not as sympathetic with the Arctic Council, but had her own ideas of what an Arctic organization should do. Maybe not what the Arctic Council should do, but what an Arctic Regional Forum should do, and kind of imposed or implemented those principles. And there is some disagreement with the way that Canada has privileged the local, and especially its local. So there's local all over the Arctic, everyone has a local, but Glucock in Canada said, you know, I think we thought that our local was everyone's local, or at least we imposed what we needed for our local onto everyone else's locals, and that was a big problem. And so it wasn't only privileging the North or the Arctic, but it was really, you know, Nunavut and even Inuit homeland almost. So even if you were from Yukon or you're Gwich'in or Dene, you didn't get as much attention either. So I think there's a big privileging of the local, and everyone who's not from one of the Arctic states, and everyone who's not from the North, who feels a stake in the Arctic, felt like this is very exclusive. And someone mentioned before, there's the spectrum of Arcticness. And certainly Nunavut is at the top of that spectrum of Arcticness, but where did everyone else fit in? They didn't feel like they fit into this agenda. So, you know, this has been written about before by Lassie and by myself and others, but in that period between 2008 and 2011, there was an Arctic consensus. So when all those national strategy documents came out, they really talked about the exact same things. It was environment, economic development, oil and gas, indigenous, science, cooperation. All of them, you basically said those things. And we had an Arctic consensus. But so what happened to that consensus? This was only 3 years ago. And what I think happened is that, you know, it kind of triggered, so we used to be a theater of the Cold War. And then in the 1990s and early 2000s, it became the zone of cooperation, which is still what some people talk about. But I think now we're in this period where people are demanding activity. And when you're starting to have to kind of put the rubber on the pavement, then there's an opportunity for disagreement. So it's easy in 1996 and easy in 2006 to say, you know, apple pie and motherhood kinds of issues, sustainable development and environmental protection. Who's going to say, no, we don't want environmental protection, we don't want sustainable development? Everyone's on board with that. But when it comes to implementing it, now you're seeing where kind of the different interests are maybe in tension or conflictual. So now that the council is more proactive, there's now this opportunity or this occurrence, this event, that there's some disagreement on how that actually gets played out. So how has the Arctic Council actually talked about sustainability and sustainable development? Probably everyone's familiar with the Ottawa Declaration. And in fact, so it says, what does the Arctic Council do? The two main pillars are sustainable development first and environmental protection. And of course, sustainable development was the reason you have the Arctic Council, because if it was just environmental protection, it could have been just the Arctic Environmental Protection Strategy from 1991. So it was Canada, especially in the 90s, pushing this refocus 20 years ago, saying we should focus on sustainable development. So that, you know, that already happened. How have they defined sustainable development? That would be economic and social well-being, improve health conditions and cultural well-being. So again, this concept of economic development being part of it is 20 years old. In 2000, the Sustainable Development Working Group was established because, you know, that there was not much action, not much traction on the sustainable development side. And again, it's going to promote economic activity. This was 14 years ago. And in the Russians, when they I know this would be the Icelanders. No, I think the Russians, after the Icelandic chairmanship, when they said what they were going to do, they're going to introduce a Sustainable Development Action Plan. Again, trying to get more action, more traction on sustainable development. And I point this out because when Canada said its agenda, some people would think this is foreign to the mandate of the Arctic Council. And again, in Canada, we're kind of perplexed. As you know, we've been talking about this for 20 years, and somehow this is new to some of you. You know, it's all over the Arctic Council website. So what did Canada mean by development for the peoples of the North? It was responsible Arctic resource development, safe Arctic shipping, and sustainable circumpolar communities. And again, for us, these were apple pie and motherhood kinds of issues. Who was against any of those bullet points? But people were. So the Arctic Institute, in a blog after Kiruna, said to call the Canadian perspective unpopular would be an understatement. And Greenpeace, so I admit I'm pulling not the moderate views here, I'm pulling kind of the most salacious ones I could find that I've read on Twitter. But Greenpeace is saying, you know, the global community has ceded their authority and their opinions to these 5 Arctic coastal states, not going to take it anymore. And the ICE blogger is saying, by creating the Arctic Economic Council, no one answers, to which no one answers, they don't have the authority to attend, work with them, manipulate the activities of the Arctic Council and its working groups. So it has severely undermined its own mandate. So they don't like the idea of an Arctic Economic Council, which is Canada's big ticket item for its chairmanship, in case you missed that. And it was negating its prime function by not just focusing on protecting the environment. And again, Canada's saying, we've always been trying to do sustainable development, but all of a sudden, protecting the environment is seen by Southerners as the main function of the Arctic Council. So I just want to point this out because now I've been traveling, you know, south or to Europe or to Washington or places that aren't Canada or aren't, you know, that aren't Toronto in Canada, and it's always surprising when development is seen as negative. You know, development in the Arctic, it's ominous. But from a lot of people's perspectives, this, you know, we're talking about poverty reduction. So we're not, I think people think, and we don't even think of oil spills that much in Canada because there's not a lot of offshore. So when we do think of development, it's usually mining. So this idea of Exxon or oil spill pollution prevention, that is not top of mind even in the context of resource development. But I think I see it myself, maybe people can disagree. I see that a lot of people, when you talk about Arctic development or the Arctic Economic Council, they're imagining oil spills, inevitable oil spills. And I think it's problematic. I don't think they're wrong. Of course, that could be a consequence. So I don't think people are wrong, but I think there's more than just that when people talk about Arctic development. And so if you're trying to understand the Canadian foreign policy position, why we would focus on Arctic economic development in the Council, it's because that one on the right-hand side is a huge issue for us, huge political issue as well. So now I'm noticing all these cleavages everywhere. Now that, you know, it's not so happy or not so tight as they were in the mid-2000s. So the biggest one for me is this division between a regional perspective and a global perspective. And, you know, Leona Glucock, for sure, full-on regional perspective. It's, you know, her Arctic, her North, her indigenous peoples. And whereas the U.S., you know, focusing on climate change. Climate change is a global perspective of the Arctic. So to say climate change is the most important issue facing the Arctic is not something you will probably ever hear a Northerner say, because they'll say mental health, or they'll say jobs, or they'll say economic development, or they say schools and education. And so for the U.S. to choose climate change is, and then for Representative Papp, he says, why is the Arctic important? Because we're a marine nation. And so his view of the Arctic is very much of an ocean and an ocean region. So I find that there's a lot of tension between regional and global perspectives that somehow needs to be better bridged. Again, when I just discussed the idea that development is cast as either resource exploitation, negative, or poverty reduction, which is positive. Especially for indigenous peoples, but also for other Northerners, the tension between dependence versus self-determination. And if you can have economic development, the consequences, you continue to be dependent. And everyone agrees that self-determination is the goal that they're trying to achieve. The difference between the Arctic, Arcticness versus the high north. And not to say that one is more important than the other, or should be the goal of the Arctic Council mandate more than the other. But I don't think people appreciate how different the Canadian or the North American Arctic is to the Barents region. And when I was at the Kellogg Academy, we drove all the way to Kirkenes, which is on, it's on the Arctic. It's on the top of the map, and people had lawns. I saw lawns there, and people could grow plants and flowers, and I was just mind-boggled at how different. So if I were to compare, if you've been to Canada, it's more like northern BC. And you can drive everywhere. Maybe Kirkenes is like Prince George, and then they go to Oslo, which is, 11 hours from Vancouver, kind of the same thing. So it's just the high north is different from the Arctic, and that's okay. But where we think of the Arctic region as homogeneous, we are really conflating those two, and they do not have the same issues at all. And again, the Arctic as an ocean, which is what I think Southerners, Europeans, Chinese, Asians see the Arctic as an ocean, in which case shipping and offshore oil is really what you're talking about, or the Arctic as a homeland. And those are that is a very prominent kind of narrative point of conflict. Science versus policy. And my friend Joelle Plouffe mentioned yesterday how Leona Glucock, when she came in, said, it's not going to be about science anymore. It's going to be about policy. It's going to be about action. And people, you kind of shrink from that. But you have to appreciate how bad the history of science has been in a lot of Arctic communities where it was treated as a laboratory, and where you see tens of millions of dollars being poured into, science projects and research projects in which, as someone mentioned yesterday, the outcome is we say this is important stuff and we need to do more of it, when they have huge infrastructure deficits. So people recognize that, and we're seeing that, but that's why there's real tension there still. And I just point out this cleavage, I guess in the last 2 years, seems to be particularly prominent between Canada and the Nordic states and Europe in particular, versus the United States and Russia. And in Russia and U.S., I think these debates happen, but they're more internal. So in the U.S., it's between Alaska and Washington, D.C. And actually, PAP did say what they're going to do, and the Arctic, a couple of congressmen and senators from Alaska did already have a public response to Senator John Kerry. And they are not having what Washington wants. Climate change is not their number one priority. It wasn't a priority at all. For Alaska, their priorities for the Arctic Council chairmanship is number one, jobs and economic development. So they want the Arctic Council to deal with job creation. And number two, suicide and mental illness. And that's what Alaska wants. And that is not what Washington, D.C. sees or does, or see. That's not how they see the Arctic. Because to them, again, the Arctic is an ocean. It's not a homeland in the same way. And in Russia, honestly, I don't know what they're saying, because we only get the Moscow perspective. And presumably there's a whole regional perspective that, us English speakers just never get, which is a big problem. So to conclude, where should the Arctic Council go from here? If we're in this position where these cleavages are kind of arising, these tensions are becoming more fraught. First, I'll say, even though in principle, I support the Canadian chairmanship agenda, again, of development for the peoples, and Michael Byers talks about, I'm sure he'll confirm, but it really isn't a great place to deal with development for the peoples of the North. That's not really what regional forums do. That's not really what the Arctic Council can do. And maybe one of the reasons why you had to keep reframing what sustainable development is and what it should do is because it's not well positioned to deal with that. So what should the Arctic Council as a regional governance forum probably be doing? Environmental and oceanic issues, the 8 things that Michael Byers just mentioned. So even though you can think it's important and you can obviously point out that it's a gap, it's probably not something that the Arctic Council itself is well placed to address. What it can do, that said, and what it does do and has been doing, maybe not as successfully as it could, is play a role in shifting this dominant narrative or vision of the Arctic region as a fragile ecosystem in need of saving, to one where people imagine as a place where there are local residents and they have rights and they have responsibilities, and it's not this terra nullius that people are thinking about these problems and policies are being implemented, and it's just taking some time. So when I think of the Greenpeace campaign, Save the Arctic, very prominent, I just think, would they ever have a Save Africa campaign? Would that, it'd be horribly politically incorrect. But because people think of the Arctic only as an ocean or a marine environment, then they feel free to say save the Arctic without thinking, there's people that think they're doing okay there actually. And then kind of final conclusions for the Arctic Council going from here. The Canadian chairmanship, I think, again, when I'm brooding on this, what went wrong in the last 2 years? There's limited appetite, I think, for big domestic-oriented agendas. And I said this one before, but when the Swedish chairmanship was coming up, and Sweden was the last of the 8 Arctic states to have its chairmanship, it was pretty apathetic about the Arctic. I think it released its national strategy the day, it was the last of the 8 to release its national strategy. It released it the day it assumed the chairmanship. It kind of was, forced, like, when are you guys going to finally do this? But then its chairmanship was so good, and it's because they could really act as a neutral chair, and they could be competent in that way, and they weren't kind to impose their vision of the Arctic on everybody else. And Canada did not do that. Canada did. That was the agenda, was to try to shift the Arctic Council to thinking like we do. That was the whole point. So Michael, you say it wasn't ambitious, but I think it was totally ambitious. It was just very poorly implemented. So that's my conclusion, is we've got to move away from these big domestic-oriented agendas and towards a stronger secretariat and a stronger kind of organizational vision and leadership. But I see no signs that the U.S. chairmanship is going to be any different. They want climate change. They're going to address climate change. That's a tall order. They're going to have a regional seas agreement, or they're going to look at it. I mean, that's a big job. And this and this, and then all the things that Alaska wants. And they're going to have Special Representative Papp, and they're also going to have Bolton as the SAO chair, and also Secretary Kerry is involved, and they're going to try to get a high-profile Alaskan Indigenous person. And, that's a lot of people. When we just had this terrible administrative experience, and I think, how are those 4 or 5 people going to manage the Arctic Council chairmanship any better? But I always like to end on a positive note. So I'm seeing all these, cleavages and tensions have arisen. I'm not sure which is the right usage. And I see that it's part of a process, though. So again, when you're only talking about environmental protection and sustainable development in speeches and in declarations and in the abstract, it's easy for everyone to agree. And we've all been calling on the Arctic Council, or the environment, the entire epistemic community, saying this is really important stuff. We need to do more. We need to turn this science into policy, into action. Well, this is a healthy sign that actually people are starting to think about, how is this actually going to be implemented? Where's the money going to come from? What's it going to look like? So even though we're seeing more tension, we're seeing more cleavages, I think that's a healthy part of this process of the Arctic Council kind of moving towards a more proactive and action-oriented council. So, thank you.
Thank you, Heather. And now the last presenter before we move to the panel is Harry Bader from University of Alaska in Fairbanks. Please.
You can leave it on. That. Oh, you can. That. The others are just names. Have my stopwatch here, so I won't go over. And then, would I hit the return to move to advance it? Is that all I do?
Arrow.
Oh, the arrow thing. Okay. Like this? Oh, yep. Okay. Sure. Thank you. First of all, I just want to say thank you for the opportunity to participate in this week's events. I think we can all agree that our hosts from the University of Iceland have provided all of us with an extraordinary meeting that allowed us to have robust exchanges as well as to find new colleagues with which to collaborate. And I'm honored to participate. And I just want to say once again, let's just give some applause for the University of Iceland and all their staff. It's just terrific. Well, like so many others before me, my life in the Arctic began with the search for opportunities. I homesteaded north of the Yukon River in the late 1980s, and almost immediately I was reminded, even in a remote area of the Arctic, in the boreal forest, just how international the character of the Arctic is. My trapline that I ran, in part, paralleled the trail and abandoned camps left by Amundsen when he made his great trek from the Arctic coast to try to reach the telegraph station in the tiny village of Eagle to announce to the world that he had made it through the Northwest Passage. And so even in the most remote areas of Alaska, I was confronted with just how international the Arctic is. Also, that experience taught me just how darn difficult it is to operate in the Arctic. A fact that clearly I was a failure as a homesteader, because you see me now as a professor. Homesteading was a profession that I had to give up, not for lack of love and commitment, but it was just too difficult. So today what I'm going to do is I'm going to give some formal remarks, and then I'm going to quickly move through the slides to illustrate some main points. But I'm focusing on this because it is so true. This from Canada is that it is harder for Canadian forces to sustain operations in the high Arctic than it is for Canadian forces to sustain operations in Afghanistan. And having been part of several security TTXs with the United States and Canada with NORAD, as well as a recent Arctic Collaborative TTX with the United States, Canada, and its NATO allies this past April for the Arctic, that is a true statement. The Trans-Arctic Agenda must recognize the tremendous diversity of distinctive Arctic regions and acknowledge that there is no single homogeneous Arctic. Rather, it is a place remarkably diverse in climate, geography, and development. To address the threat, that very real threat of climate change, and to implement effective protections for the conservation and development of Arctic resources will necessitate the use of a variety of approaches, standards, and agreements differentially applied to the various regions of the Arctic. Now, the Arctic Council's Aeronautical and Maritime Search and Rescue Agreement and the Agreement on Cooperation for Marine Oil Pollution, Preparedness, and Response, as well as the new work of the IMO on polar code standards, are indeed great contributions to the collective effort of nations to cooperate in the Arctic. However, these important accomplishments all essentially approach the Arctic as a single tactical and logistical domain. Neither search and rescue or oil pollution preparedness nor the preliminary IMO standards explicitly acknowledge that North American responders face a physical and human landscape that is uniquely austere and makes effective response all but impossible, even with the most aggressive investment in infrastructure and preparedness. Therefore, prevention and deterrence, not response, capability is the best approach to Arctic security from a North American perspective. The technical and financial challenges in the North American Arctic, due to the uniqueness of this continent's environment, simply preclude maintaining a human presence and operational capability for effective response, whether it's for search and rescue, environmental protection, or border security. The United States, Canada, and Denmark, on behalf of Greenland, must approach their international obligations in a manner different from that of its European colleagues. And Europe must allow for this difference in the implementation of those agreements. The North American Arctic differs from the European Arctic in that it is colder, the sea ice is different in character, degree, and extent, the pervasiveness of continuous permafrost is greater, and it is more remote in settlement and infrastructure. So just quickly, what I'm going to do is, for purposes of this talk, I'm going to be arbitrary. I'm going to define the Arctic as that area in the world north of the Arctic Circle. And I'm going to define the European Arctic as that part of the Arctic between 20 west longitude and 60 east longitude. So it's roughly, the European Arctic is going to be roughly, from here over to here as the European Arctic. The North American Arctic, basically from here over to 170 west, and then the Asian Arctic up here to about here. So my comments refer to the Arctic in that sense. I'm going to use three physical factors to compare the Arctic and the impact that that has on capabilities. First of all, sea ice. By by the March maximum of sea ice, all the Arctic waters in North America reach an ice concentration of 100%. All of the Arctic waters of the North American continent reach an ice concentration of 100% by March. Only 1/5 of European waters in the Arctic do so. The September minimum, half of all North American Arctic waters have a sea ice concentration of 50% or more. In Europe, it is less than 10%. The majority of the Arctic's multi-year ice, in fact, now all of the Arctic's multi-year ice resides in the North American Arctic. Though it may seem counterintuitive, diminished sea ice and expanded seasons of open water increase the danger to shipping in North American Arctic waters. As the permanent ice pack retreats, more ice is released to drift and move about. The velocity of this ice is increasing now to unparalleled velocities, even though it's harder ice because it's multi-year ice, because of the increased fragmentation of the ice pack as the stronger multi-year ice flows and islands become more available. So the warming of the Arctic and the diminishment of the ice pack actually increases dangers to shipping in the North American Arctic, where it opens up opportunities for both the Northern Sea Route in the Asian Arctic and in the European Arctic. Then I want to talk about permafrost. This map does it well. 90% of the North American landmass north of the Arctic Circle is underlain by continuous permafrost. 90%. In the European Arctic, less than 5% of the European mainland is underlain by continuous permafrost. Now, obviously, the Arctic islands are underlain by continuous permafrost. But from an infrastructure investment perspective, that all but nullifies the ability to do the advanced logistics and development, such as railroads and runways and buildings and other types of infrastructure. That continuous permafrost is an impediment to infrastructure investment, and it is uniquely a North American problem, not compared to Europe, not to, obviously, the Asian Arctic has the same problem. But I'm just talking with my European colleagues now. And then population density and infrastructure. I think that's very important. We'll show some slides about this. The European Arctic, north of the Arctic Circle, so the European Arctic, north of the Arctic Circle, has 1,690,000 people living north of the Arctic Circle. Whereas in North America, the total population of folks living north of the Arctic Circle is less than 60,000. So it's 60,000 spread across 42% of the Arctic versus 1.7 million spread across or concentrated on 20% of the Arctic. That results in a population density of the European Arctic 135 times greater than the population density of the North American Arctic. What that means for infrastructure is that you have to have concentrated population, production, and ability to actually have and maintain infrastructure and to pay for it. That does not exist in the North American Arctic. This produces an infrastructure capability in Europe for the mobilization, placement of assets in an emergency that simply cannot be matched in North America. Europe has airports, port facilities, roads, railroads, transmission lines, communication networks that we can't do. What this means is that if the Arctic is to be adequately protected and its various vulnerabilities are to be addressed, the Arctic Council and other multilateral entities must shift from the current practice of uniform international standards and obligations toward a more targeted and continent-specific approach. In North America, that means the emphasis must be more on prevention than on response, because you have to prevent or deter your threat, whether environmental, criminal, terror, whatever, rather than respond to it, because you cannot respond to it. And I want to quickly go through some slides to make a couple of these points. We're talking about the North American Arctic is colder, whether you use the 10 degree centigrade isotherm or the tree line or whatever, you can see that it's pretty much for the most part north of Europe, whereas it encompasses pretty much everything north of the Arctic Circle in North America. I like this. This now shows the difference in loss of multi-year ice in the Arctic as a whole, but as you can now see, pretty much the entirety of multi-year ice resides exclusively in the North American Arctic zone. You don't have multi-year ice for the most part in Europe, and nor do you have, hence the Northern Sea Route being so navigable, you don't have it off the Asian Arctic either. And then this is what I was describing. So here is actually the population of people living north of the Arctic Circle by country. We have 18,000 people in Alaska living north of the Arctic Circle. Canada has 16,000. This is using census figures from 2005 to 2012 for every entity and district north of the Arctic Circle. Greenland has 26,000 north of the Arctic Circle, and then when you hit Europe, you have 470,000 in Norway, 240,000 in Sweden, 80,000 in Finland, and you have 1.3 million in Russia, of whom 900,000 of that 1.3 million live in this thin little zone of the European Russian Arctic. When you look at capabilities, and I want to point out then, when we look at the SAR agreement and when we look at the oil pollution and preparedness agreements and the IMO standards, we recently hosted at the University of Alaska an unclassified Arctic security tabletop exercise with the United States, Canada, and its NATO allies. Here is my point to ponder. We had an Arctic event right here. In the case of Arctic, because it's a NATO thing, so in the case of this TTX, the bad guys were a diesel-electric Chinese submarine that gets caught in the ice because they were practicing their snorkeling and things went wrong. And so we had to rescue the submarine, but we also wanted the submarine for obvious reasons. And so it was here in October. My point is that we could not sustain a 100-person response team for more than 9 days before weather and other impediments broke the logistics and supply chain, stranding everybody in Kaktovik, which created another emergency because Kaktovik would run out of food within 9 days after that. I want to counter that with the Gulf Coast response when you had the blowout. You had 17,000 responders to the Deepwater Horizon for the course of 6 months. In the North American Arctic, we couldn't sustain 100 people in 9 days. And so that's the challenge. When we talk about what ought we do in the Arctic, I would like to reframe it as what can we do? And that is why, as a North American and an Alaskan, I say prevent and deter, and uniform standards that treat the Barents like the Beaufort are going to leave the North American Arctic at risk. And unlike Las Vegas, what happens in the North American Arctic affects the entire global Arctic. And on that, I'm at 15 minutes. Thank you very much.